So last week on the show, and again this week a little bit, I've talked about the flooding and some of the natural disasters that are becoming more frequent as we go forward. You may know that last year in January, a town called Paradise burned to the ground in California. Recently in British Columbia, a small town, I think it's called Littleton, but I don't remember off the top of my head. So if you're a Canadian and I got that wrong, please correct me in the comments. Thank you very much, and I'll make a correction. But this town also burnt to the ground. In Germany, buildings and businesses have washed away. There's all these other issues going on where climate change is creating immense amount of damage. So most of the time we think about damage to stuff as being, stuff is replaceable, human lives aren't, right? That's typically the mantra, save a life first. Whatever the stuff is, it can be replaced. And that continues to be true. This segment is not meant to dispel of that notion. However, it's important to know that as disasters continue to befall us, we're going to start to run into a very interesting problem, which is insurance is going to die as an industry. So what does that mean? Effectively, what I'm talking about is we're going to get to a point where the cost of replacing things becomes too high for insurance companies to exist. Or they will just raise premiums to a point where no one can afford them except the rich. We will get to a point where the forces of capitalism push us to a point where it becomes, it's no longer profitable to be an insurance company. And actually we saw a little bit of this last year. So during the wildfires in California in 2020, there was a huge scandal. I believe this was the PG&E fire that consumed the town of Paradise. The insurance companies were breaking their contracts with people because they believed it would be cheaper for them to go to court than to actually pay out the amount that people were asking for. So remember, insurance companies only keep so much money around. The idea about insurance is that we all pay in, and that one person or two people out of say 100 might need the insurance at any time. They take a large payout, but the insurance company continues to make money because most of the people are not pulling out of the system at the same time. It's like a run on the banks. If you know what happened in 1929, when the stock market collapsed, right? Everyone went to their banks, tried to pull their money out, and of course that system collapsed too. So it's essentially the same thing as a run on the banks, which it's a run on insurance companies. When there are whole communities that are devastated all at the same time, like in the town of Paradise or Littleton in Canada, or even in Germany and Belgium where the flooding was by the Rhine, insurance companies are not going to be able to pay out because they just don't have enough money on hand to pay out. So they will try and break their contracts, or they'll file for bankruptcy, or they'll do something to avoid it. And as this continues to happen, and as disasters affect more and more people and more businesses, all of whom are insured through a very small number of companies, we're going to get to a point where it's no longer profitable for insurance to be a private entity. And as that continues to happen, we're going to get to a place where insurance becomes so expensive that only the rich can afford it, or insurance is just going to die out altogether and we start relying on our own personal vestiges of wealth to prevent the type of long-term harm that can be caused when there's a disaster that we are suddenly, in the middle of. What is most likely to happen is that governments are going to have to step in where insurance carriers cannot, because obviously the point of a government is to protect its citizens. One of the things that the government will have to protect its citizens from will be climate change. And as people are forced to relocate and move, and as they lose large amounts of property, and insurance companies are not able or willing to pay, it will come down to governments who will start to have to bear the burden of this. And by the way, this is more or less an inevitability. We should be thinking about this now. We should be thinking about either putting money away or for this type of thing, having like a national insurance of some kind, or just preparing our emergency government agencies to have the type of capital on hand, or have the ability to procure the capital needed to essentially go about large-scale insurance from a government perspective, where it's essentially safe because of the way that governments typically work. And by the way, we're going to get to a point as well where this amount of insurance being created is going to start to challenge governments who don't subscribe to modern monetary theory or are not able to, right? They share a currency with other people and are not able to print their currency, or they can't rely on fiat currency because their economy is weak or what have you, right? But because we kind of know in advance that this is what's likely to happen, we can prepare for it now. I think it bears restating because of how stark it is. Insurance as a private industry is going to die. It is inevitable. It will happen eventually as climate change gets worse, as disasters become more frequent, as insurance companies are required to pay more and more claims because of the amount of disasters that are happening. Insurance will become a venture for either only the rich, or it will become impossible to maintain as a private capitalist venture in general, and it will just die as an industry. And where the gap is left, people will have to find different ways to make sure that they can recover from whatever it is that climate change throws at them. As I mentioned last week on the show, we are no longer in the point where prevention of climate change is realistic. We are now in the adaptation phase. We must now adapt the way that we live to prevent further climate change damage, but also to recover from the amount of climate change damage that we will begin to experience. Summers will become hotter. Hurricanes will become more dangerous. There was a tornado in Philadelphia just very recently. There haven't been large dangerous tornadoes in Pennsylvania for almost 200 years. We are starting to see these disasters pick up in scope, in frequency, in dangerousness, and as we adapt to the climate essentially reacting to what we've done to it over the past couple hundred years, we need to realize that the way that we do business, and I mean literal business in this case because of insurance, it is just not tenable any longer. But because we can see this coming and we have some sense of what will happen in the future, we can prepare. So I urge people to start talking about this, especially the left should start talking about the notion of nationalized insurance of some kind, that we should be talking about the nationalizing insurance industries to make sure that when climate change affects us as individuals, there is some entity or organization there that's able to save us from catastrophe, or else we're going to be in a lot more difficult of a position than we would have been otherwise. And again, this is all because we will not be able to rely on insurance. So I don't know what necessarily the perfect answer is. I think nationalizing insurance as an entity and having it paid through tax is probably the best way to do it, but I'm sure there are people who disagree. By the way, if you do disagree and you have a thought on this that doesn't agree with mine, or you think for some reason that my assessment about the insurance industry dying is wrong, please leave a comment. I'm happy to respond to it on the next show, or even just in the comment section. I'd love to hear what you guys think.